Hey Cognition crew, we are back with Chapter 8. We're going to be looking at the second video in Chapter 8, and this is going to be a short one. I think this video is going to be a little bit short. Alright, so what we're going to be talking about is situations and memory, and what the heck that even means. So really what we're looking at here is schemas. Sometimes you'll hear people call them schemata. The plural depends on who you're talking to. And you may have heard of schemas before. You probably talk about them sometimes in social psychology, depending on the professor. You may also hear them in maybe abnormal, maybe not. But basically, schemas and schemata, what they are basically kind of frameworks of knowledge. So they act. I think of them as like a blueprint for how we view the world and how we think about the world. So you can think of them as shortcuts in a way. That basically schemas are going to help us remember what certain things are like. So let me give you an example. If I were to ask you, what happened whenever you went to the last time you went to a restaurant, and depending on when you were viewing this, that could have been a long time ago. It could have been more recently. But if you were to think back to when the last time you went to a restaurant was, you probably have, there's a certain script you can follow. There's a certain blueprint that you can follow, which is that, you went to a restaurant, and depending on if it was a fast food restaurant or more like formal place, you either got in line or went to the drive-thru, you stood in line, you went up to the counter, you placed your order, you handed the person the money, you walked over to the side. They may have given you your cup already, and you probably filled it up and then put a lid on it, got your straw, and then stood there kind of awkwardly waiting for that food to be made. So I am not a mind reader. I'm not a fortune teller. I wasn't spying on you, but I know that all that stuff happened, right? Because almost all restaurants are like that. And we can extrapolate this to lots of different kinds of interactions. For example, if I were to ask you, what was Tuesday like for your class? You would probably say okay, well, we all came in, we sat down, I put my book bag on the floor, I took out my laptop, I didn't say much. The professor came in, basically these things, they all happen, and so we encode them as these kind of scripted events because we know what to expect. They fit very nicely into our expectations. So in this way, these are very top-down approaches to viewing the world, because it is all based on what we already know about the world. So it's really, really useful for us to be able to use these. Why is it really useful? Why is it really efficient? Because it saves us processing time. It saves us processing power. What does that mean? Basically, what it means is that instead of having to remember what to do, so let me give you, maybe this will be an example. So let's say if I asked that there is a new restaurant opening up in Westfield, and this new restaurant is a franchise you've never heard of before, but it looks like it's kind of like fast food. You notice that it has a drive-thru. You notice it has a big flashy logo on it. You walk into the store, and what do? Do you stand there and you wait to be greeted by a host? Probably not, right? Do you dress up and put on a sports jacket and a nice blouse? No, you don't do that either, right? You probably go in and you probably walk straight to the counter, right? You're not going to be seated first because you've been through so many different restaurants just like that. So it saves us time and energy because we don't have to remember, this place, what you need to do, you just need to walk in, you need to stand in line, you need to hand them the money, because it's all the same. You don't have to remember all this stuff. It fits into this nice category of an experience that we call schemas. All right, so it is very helpful in that way. But the interesting thing about schemas is that even though it is very helpful for us, and even though it is very useful and it is efficient, it can sometimes lead to us making some interesting errors. What do I mean by that? Basically what I mean is if you go into something with certain expectations, that sometimes those expectations can actually cause you to misremember certain things. So an example of this would be like if you went into a doctor's office or a dentist's office, you sat around, you got your teeth operated on or whatever they do with teeth, and then you left and you got home. And when you got home, your son asks, "Hey, was there what kind of magazines did they have there?" And you may say like, "Oh, I don't know. I'm sure I saw them." Even if there weren't actually magazines there, because we have an expectation that you're going to see magazines in a waiting room because they're everywhere in waiting rooms for some reason. All right, so for example, if I ask you to study this image, I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to study this image. So you're checking it out. You know I'm going to try to trick you in some way, right? So pay close attention. All right, I'm going to take it away now, and then I'm going to ask you, where was the light coming from? When I ask this in the classroom, people get this right very easily. It's coming from the ceiling. Yeah, it's coming from the ceiling. How did I know? Not because I'm a mind reader, because this is a basic office, right? It looks like an office, and so we're going to assume, like, okay, the light comes from above, even if you paid no attention to that light whenever you were studying that image. But what if I asked you how many chairs are there? This one you may get, you may not, because it's kind of unusual for what you would expect chairs to do, right? So there were 1, 2, 3, 4 chairs. So you got a chair here, you got a chair here, chair here, and a chair here. You got 4 daggum chairs, lots of chairs. All right, now what if I asked you how many books were on the desks here? This one is, again, kind of tricky. So what would your answer be? How many do you have on desks? We go back, we look, we don't see any. The reason why that one sometimes causes people problems is because we assume, oh, if it's an office, there's probably going to be some books on desks. How many books were on the shelves, though? And again, even though you knew that there were going to be details that I asked you to remember, there's probably some of these questions that you didn't get right. Usually whenever I ask this stuff in the classroom, people get it all wrong. And so here, there's not a single book, really. There might be some magazines right here. There's some loose leaf papers all over the place, but there's no real books. So again, the reason why we get some of these right and some of these wrong is because we are classifying this as an office. We think of this situation, we easily categorize it as, okay, that room is an office. It's not a waiting room, it's not a classroom, it's not a pool, it's not a dining room, it's an office. And so we can expect certain things to be in there. And so if I later ask you what was and what wasn't there, your knowledge of what that thing is, what that schema is going to affect what you do and do not remember. All right, so here is a fascinating experiment from, I think it's like the 30s. I could be wrong about that. But this was done in Britain before cognitive psychology was around. So Bartlett here was an old school psychologist. He was interested in cross-cultural psychology, so looking at the way that people tell stories and remember stories differently across different cultures. And so the example that we have here is an oral tradition. This is a Native American oral story that was passed down and recorded by some English scientists, and then they have some English participants, and I mean English in terms of like England, like British, not, I don't mean English in terms of the language they speak. But then they ask them to read this passage. So I'm going to read this passage out loud because I know it can be really annoying to read stuff on your own in a YouTube video. So here we go. So this is the story that these English participants were read. One night, 2 men from Agulak went down to the river to hunt seals, and while they were there, it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore, and they hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of paddles and saw one canoe coming to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wish to take you along. We are going up to the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in the canoe," they said. I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone, but you, he said, turning to the other, may go with them. So one of the young men went, but the other returned home. And the warriors went up on the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home. That Indian has been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. So the canoes went back to Egulak, and the young man went ashore to his house and made a fire. And he told everybody and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I did not feel sick." He told it all, and then he became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped back and cried. He was dead. All right, so that story was conveyed to people in 1932. This was Native American stories that were presented to British participants. This isn't just the only one, but this is commonly known as the War on the Ghosts experiment, because that story was called the War of the Ghosts. And what happens is whenever people are asked to remember that passage that I just read, it really depends on their cultural background. Native Americans of this time were able to recall it very, very easily. But folks that were British had a harder time doing it. They had a harder time recalling what those details were. In fact, they would typically remember the gist of the story, but a lot of the details would have been altered. So, why is that? A big part of it is because the story that we read does not fit our traditional expectations for what a story is. For those of us that are typically used to these kind of like westernized stories, we expect stories that have characters that we get to know, a plot that involves some kind of action, and then an ending where we learn something. Usually that's the case. And we don't really see any of that here, right? When there was action, when there was an attack, it didn't really feel like the same way that, a more like English style narrative would have played out. And so it goes against a lot of our schemas for what stories are. The interesting thing here is that whenever there were things that were unfamiliar in that story, typically people would repopulate those details, those unfamiliar details, with things that better fit the schema there. So here's an example. Here they're saying, "For I have an old mother at home." That was not something that was actually in the initial story, but it was added here by a British participant. He said he could not come because he had no arms. Arms here meaning weapons, right? But again, if you were to hear this by today's standards, arms, we would think that he was talking about limbs, right? And arms, really he was talking about arrows, right? So there is, and if you read this whole thing, you'll get kind of a gist for the differences that are being played here. Whenever I talk about the stuff in the classroom, and I read this out, the things that I notice students remembering are typically the surreal parts. So they remember that there were ghosts. They remember that something black came out of the guy's mouth at the end, and they remember that that he died in some mysterious fashion. But they don't really remember that they were hunting seals. They don't remember that there were two guys at first. They don't remember a lot of these specific details. And that's just because this doesn't fit into our traditional idea for what a story is. If this story were much more conventional to Western kind of traditions, like something like Harry Potter or Hunger Games, you would have done a better job, or I should say that my class would have done a better job remembering that specific information. All right, so the next video that we have is going to be about false memories, which, as you can probably make a connection there, is very relevant to what we just talked about. All right, so I will see you there. See you soon.